Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 35th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Dan Stoller at CENIT Consulting for a conversation on medical devices in the EU, overcoming challenges and securing your CE mark. Different topics we'll be hearing today is understanding the shift from the Medical Device Directive, or MDD, which you'll hear it abbreviated today, to the Medical Device Regulation, MDR, in the EU and its implications for medical device manufacturers. We'll be hearing about insights into the challenges and complexities involved in obtaining a CE mark for the MDR, including the approval process with notified bodies and regulatory agencies in Europe. We'll hear of different strategies and best practices for managing the expenses and time-consuming aspects of submitting for a CE mark, enabling a smoother MedTech go-to-market strategy in Europe. But first, a few housekeeping slides and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is high trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics throughout the presentation today from Dan. If you do have any questions, on the right-hand side of your screen, or on your control panel, I should say, it could be on your left or right or above or down, there's an area for you to drop questions in. If you just drop those in, I'll be monitoring that throughout, and we'll be able to ask Dan some of those questions at the end. So if questions come up, feel free to drop them in while you have them, and we either save them for the end or pipe them in for Dan as he's going through if it's pertinent. In terms of handouts, there are no handouts today, so there is no section on your control panel for that. And then as a reminder, you'll receive a recording of this webinar via email, and feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. With that being said, I'd like to welcome our guest, Dan Stoller. Dan, the virtual floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Dwayne. Just a brief information about myself as soon as I get my slides set up here. It's always interesting. There we go. There. Perfect. Everything goes fine until something goes wrong. And then, as I was saying earlier, my name is Dan Stoller. I work for CENIT Consulting. It's a small company that I am part of, myself and my business partners. I myself have been in quality and regulatory affairs consulting and working for various companies over 25 years, ranging from electronics to medical devices and electronics in regulated environments. So I have a pretty good knowledge of what's required for approvals and making sure that your quality management systems pass muster so that they are ready for any of the challenges that come up. So with that said, and we'll go ahead and move on. And the next thing we'll do is, as soon as again, still getting used to my slides. Here we go, the most important part, what we want to cover. Dwayne's already gone over this. What we want to do is just talk briefly about the shift from Medical Device Directive to Medical Device Regulation, and what that means, and try to give you more information about how to be able to more effectively manage this. So first off, you've heard a lot of things now about MDR approval, trying to get MDR approval. It's so hard, it's so long. Is it really worth our time? Well, let's look at why you really should consider getting MDR approval. The EU is a large market. It shows that you are demonstrating your commitment to patient safety. There are stricter controls now involved, and we'll start going over that. It does increase your transparency. One of the big things to always think of is, what is the cost of non-compliance? So if you don't have this, what is it going to cost you in terms of business, reputation? One of the other things in the other reasons are listed there. You know, it's in many cases it's cheaper than getting a pre-market authorization or a full-on de novo if you can't get a 510K, depending upon what your device is and what its class is. One of the other things that isn't on the slide to consider is well, depending upon your reimbursement strategies, it may be easier and for you to get money faster, even with the time that it takes to get MDR approval, than it is to set up a full reimbursement strategy and getting codes to be able to get reimbursement in the US. I'm not an expert on reimbursement. I can refer you to people if you have any questions about that. There are a lot of good companies out there that can help you with those type of solutions. First off, let's talk about the change. You know, we had MDD for quite a while. Everybody was comfortable with it. Everybody was moving along fine. And then, you know, this new regulation comes up, the MDR. So we've gone from Medical Device Directive to Medical Device Regulation. So why did the EU decide to do this? Plain and simple, the MDD became outdated over time. I mean, if you consider the way that technology goes, it doesn't cover a lot of devices that have been developed since the MDD was first published, and that was back in 1993. So things like software as a medical device wasn't properly dedicated to and covered in the MDD. It just kind of slotted in. You know, apps, which are a form of software, are something that was never considered, and the use of apps in different types of health-based and healthcare applications. Those things combined with the average age of EU citizenry steadily increasing over time, so that means that there is more of a need for devices that are safe and effective to be able to help them live their best lives in the years that they still have. So what I want to do now is talk about the key differences between the Medical Device Directive and the Medical Device Regulation. There's new safety requirements for medical devices. There are actually, quite a few of those. And as we go through with those, there's things called, general safety and performance requirements. GSPRs, these are things that you now have to complete and have information for before you even go to market with them. So you have to have this information readily available. There are new requirements that cover, devices that administer or contain drugs, specific requirements for devices that contain tissues of human or animal origin, requirements for disposal of your device. Now, once your device has reached its end of life, how is it properly disposed of? Also requirements for devices to be used by people who are not medical professionals. So if this is somehow a take-home medical device, what are the requirements for a person who isn't a trained medical professional to be able to effectively use this device? And also now there are general requirements for labeling. There's also some post-market requirements now, certain things with regards to FDA. We've had post-market surveillance in, and now this has become something that the EU has taken and is now adopting. So you'll have, how do you maintain your information over time? How are you finding out about the performance of your device once it gets into the field? Another big thing is medical device classifications have changed. Now, it means now if you were a class 1 device under MDD, you may not be that under MDR. Software is one of the classic examples of that. In many cases, software that was a class 1 under MDD is now class 2A or sometimes 2B under MDR. So you really have to check what your medical device classification is. And that's something that's different from FDA because FDA is more that the device categories have been determined, and these things are actually written into US law as to what the device type is and what the classification is. In MDR, it's a different process and it's more of a risk-based and risk-focused approach. So that's something that is significant. And you may also find that just because your device is one class in FDA, it may not be the same class in MDR. And there's also the requirement of a unique device identifier. So as I've talked about, talking about new safety requirements for medical devices, in addition to pre-market, you have to have GSPRs, making sure that you have your post-market surveillance system in place, and make sure that there's incident reporting driven by the risk level of the device. They've broadened the term of medical device, which is something that I didn't cover previously, but under this point, it's become, in the past, there were certain devices that weren't considered a medical device under the MDD. They were in other countries, and now they've broadened that definition to include things like contact lenses, liposuction equipment, high-intensity radiation equipment. One thing that wasn't included in MDD but now is included in MDR that is important is cleaning, disinfection, and sterilization requirements for medical devices. Again, we talked about the different device classifications and unique device identifier. For those of us in the US that have FDA products, we're not unfamiliar with that. So most companies already have a UDI system set up. The EU is still finalizing their UDI format. So we don't know if it's going to follow what FDA is using, which, if you're using a company like GS1 to handle your UDIs, you're set. We just don't know right now if the EU is going to commit to that, and that's still being hashed out. Now the question arises, why is it so hard to get MDR approval? The first thing is trying to get a hold of a notified body that's going to review your application has been difficult. And you wonder, why is that? The EU knew this was happening. These notified bodies knew this was happening for years in front of it. Why hasn't things been smoother? Well, one of the things is notified bodies have less capacity than they did before MDR. And what I mean about that is in order to get authorized to be able to assess and issue CE marks for a regulation, you have to go through an administrative review process. And that review process includes review of your organization, your capacity, the qualifications of the people who will be doing these reviews, all these things. So as a result of that, fewer notified bodies were able to complete their necessary registrations before the regulation actually rolled out. So now all of a sudden you've got decreased capacity. At the same time, you have all these device applications that are going in because as part of the transition, medical devices that had an MDD, a valid MDD certificate, now had to go back and apply for MDR. So now you've got all these existing devices that are coming in saying, well, we need to make this change and we need to get upgraded and we need to get it upgraded. And that doesn't even include new companies coming in with products on the market saying, hey, I need to get approved as well. So you've got smaller capacity, larger numbers of applications coming in, and all of a sudden you've got a big funnel and those things have started to clog up. So now what's being done? Well, the deadlines for compliance to the MDR have been moved back. A lot of this has been well documented over time. Depending upon the risk level and classification of your device, you may not need to be fully MDR compliant until 2028. So that's some breathing room, but that still doesn't help with trying to get into and get your certificate done as soon as possible. Also, the notified bodies that are currently registered are adding personnel, particularly in areas where devices have software or AI, because it's a very popular area. It's the largest growth area for devices, and so they need more personnel to be able to handle these requests. There are also more notified bodies that are getting registered, but again, because of the process that it takes to go through that, it does take an extensive amount of time. So the question is, how to handle submission challenges. Now, if you have a current MDD certificate or an active implantable medical device directive certificate, they were different before, and MDR combines them now, but previously, if you have an MDD cert or an AIM-DD cert, that is current, you're ahead of the game. But there's a big but here. You have to look at what what I have listed on the slide as to what the conditions are. One of the biggest ones is that you must not have any significant changes in your design or intended purpose as you're transitioning over to MDR. If you do that, it will automatically dump you into an MDR approval path, and your timeline gets kicked back significantly. Any proposed changes that you do have currently must not pose an unacceptable risk to patient health or safety. If it's something that you're not sure about currently, I would recommend that you hold off on those types of changes until you're ready to do a full transition into MDR. You will need to file an extension request with your notified body that you have your current MDD or AIMDD certificate with. The clock is ticking on that. You have until May of next year to get that extension request in, and then later in that year, in September 26th, so just over a year from now, you need to have a written agreement in place with your notified body as to how and when you're going to transition from MDD to MDR. Now let's talk about how to handle some of these challenges that will come up, because you're coming in, you're going into a new regulation. The notified bodies are still learning a lot about the regulation and how to work on the approval process. So everybody's learning together and separately. So this really requires a lot of communication going back and forth. It also puts a lot of emphasis back on you as the manufacturer, distributor, etc., to make sure that you have as much information as possible and that it's lined up and ready to go when you're ready to submit, or when a notified body comes back to you with questions. So go through the guidance and go through the actual regulation and understand your particular device class and what your review path is going to be to get your CE mark. There is an organization in Europe called the MDCG, which is a medical device. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but the website is there. Use the guidance documents. It is a wealth of information that can help you. There's a lot of guidance documents that can help you with classification, submission issues, post-market surveillance, just a lot of valuable information off of that website. Risk, with regards to the risk of your device. Understand what the risk is, what's possible, review your risk, make sure you're doing things in line with 14971, the risk management standard that helps you take care of a lot of the questions related to risk. And of course, make sure that you consistently document and that you maintain over time. Again, playing into that post-market surveillance area, that you're taking that information and you're putting it back into your risk analysis to see if there are things that you need to change over time. You need to get yourself a PRRC, fancy name for person responsible for regulatory compliance. This is basically a liaison between you, the manufacturer, and the notified body, and if necessary, once the device is approved, ministers of health or the applicable regulatory authorities in Europe. So they become a go-between. If there are any questions, they can work through that individual. Prepare now. If you haven't already, you need to start preparing, just because of the amount of paperwork that you need to compile to be able to make a submission. It's significantly more than it was in MDD. So again, check the regulations, check the guidance documents, and see what are the things that you need, because it's going to start they're going to start diving down into technical specifications. Again, heavy on risk. Make sure that you have your risk management documented fully and is ready for them to review. And once you do submit, make sure that that information is as complete as possible. The best way to handle challenges is to communicate, communicate, communicate. Talk with your notified body as much as you need to. Once you start the process with them, if they come back with questions, please be as responsive and timely as possible, because you run the risk of your application getting put on hold. And once you get put on hold, somebody undoubtedly will jump ahead of you, and that will keep pushing your submission further and further back. So once questions come in, be ready to answer them as soon as you can. That's pretty much everything that's involved with it. We can go ahead and start taking questions, Dwayne.
Yeah, awesome. So for those who are listening in, drop your questions in there. Dan, we had a few more. We had a few come in prior to the prior to your presentation. First one, is there a DB, which I'm assuming stands for database, to search and find out the class of their medical device? I know you touched on in the presentation, class 1, 2, 2A, 2B, 3.
There isn't a true like unified database just yet. Unimed is they're working on it, but it doesn't exist in a full usable format. So it's very hard to determine. The best thing I can say is look up the MDCG guidance, look at the regulation, and there's a good flow chart that actually helps kind of guide the path as to what risk your device is.
Yeah, building on that question, is there like, are there like product codes like there are for the FDA that you can go search, or how does that work? Not
No,
really.
no, unfortunately, there's no, it comes down to what your product is and what your risk has been determined to be. That's one of the biggest differences between US FDA and the EU, is that FDA takes these classifications that are at the legal level, at the at the US regulation level, and then FDA has assigned product codes underneath those regulations as to what fits there. Um, it's a bit of work, but you might try to find a device that's already been CE marked for MDR in Europe, and if it's also done in the US, you can go back through the registration database to track down that product and see what the FDA equivalent is, and maybe that gives you somewhat of an indication, but there is no true one-to-one mapping anymore.
Okay. Um, Another question building off this, and these aren't from before, these are mine. But you talked about communicate, communicate, communicate. You also mentioned find notified bodies not having enough resources, right, to field this. Are those timelines delayed from a communication perspective? And I guess comparing it to the US, is it like a similar process? Like, could you do a pre-sub? How do you, I guess, how's it differ?
Yeah. What you can do is once you've chosen a notified body, before you sign the contract, start talking to them about what the details are, and basically come up to them and say, if I'm going to sign this, what are your commitments in terms of questions that we have, things like that. You can talk to a notified body as part of, well, we want to go ahead and do our registration with you guys, but what's our best fit? We believe that we are this class and this, and we'd like to have that discussion with you in advance before we go down the actual submission route.
Yeah. Okay, great. One of the questions that came in, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but timeframes involved in getting the certifications. Is there like well, I guess this is hard too, because like you can look at, we look at averages in the US and say, okay, well, how long is the average it takes to get a 510K and that sort of thing? What does that look like, I guess, from the EU perspective?
Yeah, it's a little different because again, with the US, with regards to 510Ks or other submissions, there are things, basically, there are established timelines that FDA has for things. So if you submit a 510K that you're going to get an answer back within, roughly 6 months, usually faster than that, but depending upon the complexity of things, unless there's an issue, in which case the clock stops, you answer, and if that answer is deemed acceptable, then the clock starts back up again. With the EU, I've been getting information from some different notified bodies, not to mention any names, but the timelines that I've seen originally were starting out at 2 years, then dropped down to 18 months. There was a point at the very beginning when notified bodies weren't even accepting other applications because they were so socked with what they had in terms of their current customers. That has changed, but it's still, I would say that you're probably looking at around 12 to 15 months from the time that you start submission to getting your full CE mark. There are notified bodies that will offer you expedited review times, which they'll cut the time in half, but they'll almost double your fees. So that's something you need to take into consideration. It's a business decision that you need to make as part of trying to get this type of approval.
Okay, great. Next question is, how will the new regulation regarding batteries affect the CE marking process?
It's a good question. That I think that's something. I think medical devices are exempt from the battery rules. Especially active implantables with things like RoHS, stuff, making sure that things are properly disposed of. I'd have to go back and double check, but I believe that those types of exemptions are still in effect.
Great. Interested in learning more about combination device and topical drug. So basically a rigid contact lens and ophthalmic eye drops. How is, I guess, more broadly then, I'll take this statement and kind of make it a question. How are combination devices treated in Europe? I guess when you compare it to the US, and same with topical drugs.
As far as combination devices in Europe, it just goes to class, based on risk. So it's all going through a notified body. It's not like you're going through a different agency in FDA with regards to your device, with slightly different guidances depending upon the type of product. But again, that's something that you would definitely want to talk with your notified body about when you commit to it.
Okay, great. Okay, let me ask some of the questions. Those were the ones that came in before. Let me ask some of these ones that were asked while we were talking here. Here's a comment, actually, as someone working in a notified body. Biggest challenge we are seeing is lack of sufficient clinical data, even on legacy devices. This is the biggest reason we are seeing applications being rejected, refused. See MDCG 2020-6, Appendix 3 for hierarchy of clinical evidence. So less of a question, more of a comment, but curious on your any kind of feedback on that or comment.
I would say that is great information, especially considering the source. I had not had information as to why things were getting kicked back, but now that makes things abundantly clear. And kudos to this person for giving us the specific reference as to where you need to check things with regards to as part of your submission, making sure that it's correct.
Oh, that's great. How about that? Great information on the Galen Data webinar series. I love it. Okay. What is the average time required for MDR approval?
Well, we just talked about that. That's from when you submit. That doesn't even include the time that you're spending to compile all this information to be able to, submit.
Yeah.
That can take. I won't say anything with regards to the clinical data aspect of it, but just compiling the information can take 6 months or more, and that's provided you have everything that you need. The problem is during the process, as you start going through it, you start finding more and more things that you need, and then you're starting to gather this, and then you're trying to gather this next thing, and then there's clinical information.
Mm-hmm.
What data can you supply that's reliable and has enough of a base to it to prove that the device is safe and effective?
Yeah, Dan, I think I have a few questions here, kind of leading into some of this too. So before the MDR, most companies would go to Europe first, right, and then come to the U.S., even if they're U.S.-based companies. Now we're seeing a huge shift where everyone's going U.S. first and then EU eventually. But honestly, it's a discussion point now of like, do you go to EU, Japan, Australia, China, Canada, Brazil, right? I mean, it's less straightforward, I guess. Are there, and I don't remember which class. I know I had a conversation with another regulatory consultant where they were kind of saying, in a scenario, there is a few scenarios where you still might want to go to Europe first before the US, even with the MDR. Curious in your comments on that, if you have an opinion, is that the case? Or, if I'm a company that's coming to you and saying, hey, Dan, where do I go first? If I'm just evaluating regulatory barriers, is there a time where you would say, yeah, it's a good idea for you to go to Europe, Dwayne, first?
Um, the infamous answer, it depends.
Yep.
Depends upon the risk of the device. If it's a low risk device and it's something that, again, going back to that reimbursement piece, that has a well-established reimbursement model that is easy to get into in Europe, as opposed to trying to develop a whole new strategy for the US, then it may make sense to do Europe first.
Mm-hmm.
But again, you have to take all these factors into consideration to make the final decision as to what market you want to get into first.
Sure. I mean, if you need clinical data, does it really matter which one you go to first? Either way, it's going to, yeah.
Yeah, it really doesn't if you need clinical data, because say, for example, you do EU first, as long as your clinical studies and your clinical information is gathered, using good clinical practices, good clinical guidelines, the studies are registered and all that, then FDA more likely than not is going to accept that data.
Yeah. Super helpful. The other question I had in relation to this as well, or I guess at least comment to the comment of the clinical data on legacy devices. Can you maybe comment on some of the different ways, if you are a legacy device in the EU, and you're trying to collect clinical data? I mean, there's obviously you could do it prospectively, right, and start gathering it from now. But there's also a way to do it retrospectively as well, too, right? I mean, there's different ways to address this need for clinical evidence, correct?
There are different ways, but again, that's something that you really need to have that conversation with your notified body to say, look, we've have this thriving, post-market surveillance plan. We've been using it ever since the product was released. It was released so many years ago. This is the data that we've gathered over time. These are the things that we've seen. This is how we've taken this information, put it back into our product. Start with that as your basis, and then see what other things they need from a clinical standpoint. Again, because the requirements have changed, there may be additional information that they need that you can only get through current clinical evaluation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question that came in on low risk devices. Many legacy commodity products do not have clinical studies and rely on literature search and data. But keep in mind, there are a few publications on common devices that have been on the market for decades. I think that was more of a comment. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and that dovetails into what we were just talking about, is there may be information that's currently out on the market that you can submit as part of a clinical evaluation in addition to information that you have. And again, I always err on trying to find out up front what I need as opposed to finding out halfway through, now I have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing when I'm working with customers in the US and they're not sure about certain things, and I tell them the easiest thing to do, as long as it meets the criteria, is to have a pre-submission meeting with FDA. It's free, it's a small amount of time to be able to compile and schedule, get the meeting, get the information back. And you get, especially if you do a face-to-face or a webinar type meeting where you can get information directly from FDA's mouth as to what their thinking is.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious too, is at the FDA, when you send an application to the FDA, you get assigned division, right? You get assigned a reviewer. You're not picking those. In this scenario, what's interesting is like you said, you get to interview, or you get to talk to these notified bodies ahead of time. Is there, from your side of things, you said to ask questions like, hey, if I sign this, what does this mean, that sort of thing. What are some other things you're looking for when you're choosing a notified body?
There's various things, and some of it comes down to what your business needs are. The other is, what is the reputation of the notified body? How long have they been around? How long have they been doing work in medical devices, let alone MDR? Obviously, part of the reason why the funnel got shrunk so much when the regulation changed is that the largest resourced notified bodies were able to make this transition easier than a lot of the smaller ones. So the smaller ones are still trying to catch up, or they're looking at it from a business standpoint for them to see, is it worth it for us to go through all of this to get registered to do it?
I don't know if you mentioned it, or we at Project MedTech, we did a podcast on this with a guy named Rob Packard, and he was part of the he was in a notified body for a while. Didn't the number of notified bodies shrink from like 90 something to 20 something?
Yeah, when MDR first came out, yeah, before that, actually, I think it was like 127 or something like that. It was up in the
Wow.
hundreds that could do MDD. But once MDR hit, again, just like at that
Wow.
point, like the largest resourced notified bodies, it's dedicated resources to get this done, and we're able to do it in a timely fashion, and now everybody else is playing catch up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I can't remember what the number is now. I want to say it's around 40,
Okay.
but still, it's significantly smaller than the number beforehand.
Yeah. Okay. We have one other comment from the person who working inside the notified body. Another big challenge, the equivalence bar is set quite high under MDR. Must show clinical, technical, and biological equivalence to claimed equivalence devices for purposes of clinical evaluation. The manufacturer must also have full access to tech file of claimed equivalent device. And then they mentioned CMDCG 2020-5. So another good one, I guess, there. But is maybe that's some of the major differences, I guess, right now between MDR and FDA, is that?
Yeah, you could, with FDA, it was substantially equivalent. And substantially equivalent, comes down to the opinion of the reviewer or reviewers as to that, and combined with the information that you provide to show substantial equivalence. Now, as this person has reference to, that bar in Europe is higher and it's more detailed, particularly with regards to the requirements. So again, great information from this person, and I'm glad that it's coming out in this webinar to get this information out to people.
Yeah. I guess, Dan, the what's the what was the reason, or to the best of your knowledge, I should say, the reason for some of this switch, right? Like now we're starting to get into a little bit of like, it's obviously factual, but there is like a piece of this now where it's like, well, who's doing it right, right? Obviously, MDR, there's more of a requirement for clinical evaluation from products on the market, where in the FDA, it's not that it's not there, but it's not nearly as strict, right?
Yeah, it's different, and it's different based on device class uh, with FDA, because obviously higher risk, newer technology that FDA hasn't evaluated before, they require more information. So your pre-submission, your pre-market submission has
Hmm.
to have a lot more information in it, as opposed to if it's something that's substantially equivalent or extremely similar to something that's already been cleared by FDA, then you can go 510(k) substantially equivalent route. In Europe, everything has to meet requirements. And then if you're a higher risk, yes, there are some additional requirements, but everybody has pretty much the same bar to start with.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Dan. No other questions from me. No other questions from the guests as of now. Is there anything else you want to add in closing?
Nothing other than, you know, any questions about documentation, about things with regards to the regulation, I'd go back to the guidance page. There's a lot of great information in there. It's fairly well written. It's easy enough to get to, and it's readily available. So, look
Yeah.
that up.
Awesome. And one more thing to add, as the Galen cloud features and benefits are up. Our our same person here just adding great pieces of advice here. They added in here that some of the main reason for the increased requirements under MDR, to their understanding, right? So it is speculation, right? But metal on metal prostheses, and then hip implants,
Yeah,
and the breast implant scandal, obviously as well.
yeah.
Um,
Those were two things that really basically wrecked everybody's confidence in the
yeah.
system, as it were. The breast implants was one. More recently, yes, hip implants started out as being metal on metal, and there were a lot of reliability issues with those implants. And it was things that weren't fully considered as part of the process. And now, those two things have really driven a lot of the new requirements, the reason why those things are in place, and that's why everybody has that same bar to get over.
Hmm. The one thing that came to mind while I'm thinking of this before we hop off here, is there is a documentary on Netflix, or at least it was on Netflix, called The Bleeding Edge.
Mhm.
And there is some the same thing about the not needing clinical data to be on the market. They brought up a few different examples. I think one was the cobalt chromium metal on metal hip implant. There was another one on the IUDs, and then there was also one on the surgical robotic instruments, right? And so another thing, again, it's thought provoking, but probably worth a watch if you're wondering why maybe there's a big uptick in the need for clinical data and more regulation. But anyways, I think that's it. So Dan, thank you so much for doing this. The next Galen Data webinar series is the end of September. It's the 26th. And that will be with Full Spectrum, I believe. So it'll be the 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So anyone who's on, hopefully you can join us for that one as well. But Dan, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks to Galen Data for continuing to host informational and webinars for the MedTech community.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Galen for giving me the opportunity, and thank you, Dwayne, for hosting.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.